Good morning and welcome back to the Scottish Land Commission and Agricultural Law Association's Mock Mediation, Mediation in the Tenant Farming Sector. I will shortly hand you over to Robin Burley again, but before then a reminder that we'll be having a further question and answer session later this morning. If you do have any questions at any time during the morning, please ask them using the Q&A function on your screens, and hopefully we'll have time to put them to the panel later on. The participants in the mediation are all doing such a good job that you may have forgotten that this is actually a mock mediation and that the characters and events are entirely fictitious. Please do bear in mind that what the participants are saying does not necessarily reflect their own personal views. So, back to the mediation, which is now well and truly underway. Will the parties manage to reach a consensus? And if so, on what basis? Over now to Robin Burley, who will again guide us through these final parts of the mediation process. Robin.
Good morning and welcome back to the Pitlochie Farm dispute. It was a pretty full day in our virtual mock mediation rooms yesterday. We squeezed what might have been several hours of mediation into 3 videos of little over an hour in total. Today, we will be doing something similar. And of course, the question on all your minds is, will George and his daughter Megan live happily ever after as farmers of Pitlochie? And will they have Sean, his wife Sue, and their twins as neighbours? But before we find out how this tale of everyday landlords and tenants plays out, let's have a reprise of what happened yesterday. The mediators held what I call check-in meetings with the 2 parties in their private rooms and moved on to a joint meeting where the parties and their advisors set out positions which showed there was a wide gulf between them. There was then an unpacking of the detail behind these positions in the advisors' rooms, first with the 2 land agents and then with the solicitors. These meetings demonstrated the extent of the differences, but also showed that there might be some scope for accommodations to be made. Offline, the advisors had caucus meetings with their principals without mediators' involvement, and so the mediators were able to pop out for a virtual coffee. The parties' caucus meetings allowed each party to take stock of what was discussed with the other party advisor and consider whether to adjust their positions. The last of the trio of videos yesterday was the mediators, refreshed from their coffee, holding meetings with each party team and discussing with them their position as we approach the end of day 1 of the mediation. Following these meetings, it was clear that the parties are still far apart, but progress is being made. George is looking for more than a 10-year lease, and Sean might agree to a first option on a contract farming, but no longer than 10 years as a lease. Entry to the farmhouse is a gap to be bridged, with George thinking in terms of a year and Sean wanting as soon as possible, but certainly by May. The improvement schedule is almost agreed if we count the items on the agreed list. But in value terms, there's a yawning chasm, which is the potato shed, valued at almost half the aggregate improvement sum. The legal arguments have been resolved about, the legal arguments have not been resolved about whether this is accepted as an amnesty improvement, or as Mark Fogden put it, a breach of tenancy which seeks to commit his client to writing a thumping big check over which he has no control. This, and indeed the remainder of the improvement schedule, is not a small issue for Sean, who may find the funds to pay for the farmhouse improvement, but wishes to avoid writing a check for any more. Before we view the first of the 3 mock mediation videos we have for today, I wish to use my pound diamond to explain where we are in this visualization of the stages in mediation. Yesterday, we were deep in the understanding stage, and we continue in that stage for the first part of this morning as the mediators seek to further understand not only the issues, but also the possibilities. As I explained yesterday, we are likely to stay in the understanding phase of mediation for longer than the other stages. It is by seeking to open up the possibilities and exploring wider options that we create a larger canvas on which our parties will be able to shape the terms of settlement. We will now meet both parties and their advisors in joint session with the mediators, exploring how things are going and what areas still need more attention.
Well, thank you everybody for agreeing to come together like this. You have done a lot of work since we were last together as a group. We've met with you privately, you've met with each other, the solicitors have met with each other, and that's been really helpful in terms of just marking where we're going with this. There's still quite a lot of work to do, so I thought it might be quite helpful to kind of regroup and just say very quickly where we are with things. So can I turn to Heather, representing the landlord? You're representing Sean Bellway?
Yes, I think we have made quite a bit of progress, but there's a few issues that are still very important to iron out. So one of the very important factors for my client is the farmhouse.
Yeah.
And he's suggesting two options with regard to the farmhouse, either taking it back on the imminently within the next few weeks, we suggest by the 28th of November,
yeah,
or waiting until next May, so May 2021, depending on how the Smith family would wish to deal with the improvements, which I will come on to. And if it's possible to agree to move into the farmhouse, then the Bellway family would need permission for early access while the Smiths are still living there, so that they can do things like carry out surveys and decide some works that they'd want to do to the farmhouse if they're able to move in. Secondly, PR and media side of things is important. There's been quite a lot of nasty comments on social media, and we just need something to try and deal with that as best we can. We obviously can't control what third parties say, but perhaps a very short statement to the press, hopefully saying by the end of today that a satisfactory outcome has been reached, so that this doesn't.
Are you talking about a joint statement, Heather?
A joint statement,
yeah,
by landlord and tenant released to the press,
okay,
just saying they've reached an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing more of interest for you here, guys, really. And then onto the slightly more complex technical side, the improvements. We've got two suggestions for how to deal with improvements. I'll come back to that because that's kind of the more complicated legal side. But if all these points can be agreed, then my client's had a very long, hard think about it. And we have gone through all the reasons why we feel that a 5-year short limited duration tenancy would be fair. But he has heard what George has said. He does understand the need for George and Megan to have a bit more time. And he has no objection to them farming. It's more that he wants to have more of an active role in the future. Having said that, he would be agreeable to offer a 10-year modern limited duration tenancy in favour of George and Megan jointly and survivor of them, along with a contractual agreement at the end of that 10-year term. This was the idea that I floated with Hamish.
Yeah.
I now have firm instructions on that. A contractual agreement to give either George and Megan, or solely Megan, subject to suitable references at the relevant time, a right of first refusal to be the contractor in the event that a contract farming agreement is going to be entered into. And then moving on to the improvements, we've got two suggested options, A and B. So option A would be that cottage number 1 is gifted to George Smith for no consideration, and the Bellways move into the farmhouse on the 28th of May 2021, and in exchange the landlord receives all the improvements free of charge. So effectively the cottage gift clears off the improvements financial claim, and that would include the potato store, which is not in fact accepted, but for the purpose of a settlement would be. And then in turn, the rent for the farm would need to reflect the improvements that are now in the possession of the landlord. And the sale of the cottage would need to include a preemptive right to repurchase in the event of a sale by George. So what the landlord doesn't want is for George, we don't think this is likely, but for George to then sell on the cottage rather than staying there in terms of the sort of spirit of this agreement. The proposed rent under that arrangement would be an enhanced rent of £150,000 per annum. And we can discuss the breakdown of that later. Perhaps the agents can discuss how that's broken down, but it has been looked at scientifically. And then the option B would be possession of the farmhouse imminently as of the 28th of November this year, and a payment for the improvement element of the farmhouse, which is £45,000 per the schedule that the agents have already managed to agree under this mediation. And then all the balance of the improvements would roll into the new modern limited duration tenancy, with the exception of the potato store, which will be excluded. So all the other items will be listed in a schedule to the MLDT and settled at the end of the MLDT and valued at the end of the MLDT, under exception of the potato store. And under that option, the proposed rent is £90,000 per annum. And we hope that captures some of the spirit of some of the suggestions that have been discussed between parties, but we understand that's rather a lot for the tenants team to digest, but we appreciate they may have some initial comments following that.
Okay, that's helpful. Hamish, can we turn to you now? Would you like to say where you think progress has been made and what still needs to be talked about? And if you want to comment on the suggestions made by Heather to you, I think you've heard about them before now, and then that might be helpful.
Well, Heather had emailed me with an outline of the proposals that she's just been explaining, and I've had an opportunity to discuss them with George and with Tom. And I think it's fair to say that we were pleased about the proposals that have been made, and we're beginning to see that it will be possible to reach an agreement here. We do have concerns about some of the details, particularly with regard to some of the rental figures that Heather and the other has proposed. We don't think that those rental figures would be acceptable, but I think that we're very hopeful that with further discussion, it'll be possible to resolve these issues. But we are quite interested in a deal that would involve a modern limited duration tenancy for a period of 10 years with an option to take up a contract farming agreement after that. And we do see that, subject to ironing out the technical details, it's beginning to look like we might be able to get to an agreement that we would be able to live with.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful, Hamish. Thank you for that. Lindsay, do you want to come in here?
Yes, I will. I mean, first of all, thanks very much indeed for both parties. Both Pamela and I felt that it would be helpful if George and Sean had an opportunity with us to just meet and talk about, I suppose, what really matters to each of you. I'm not saying that what's just been talked about doesn't matter to you, it matters a great deal, but there are maybe other things. And we recognise that you haven't had a great deal of opportunity to talk together. So that's what we're going to propose, if that is agreeable to Sean, to George, and to the advisors. Does that seem a reasonable thing to do at this stage?
That seems, Lindsay, very fair. Very good idea.
Yes, happy with that.
Okay.
Good. Well, that's what we'll go on and do next. probably quite a brief meeting. We'll see how it goes. And I expect there'll be an opportunity for the land agents and for the solicitors perhaps to have discussions about what's been proposed, what's been talked about so far in this joint session. Thank you very much.
As we leave the joint session of parties and advisors, it's a good opportunity to reflect on where we're at. We have been immersed in well-charted territory in which the parties, guided by professional advice of their lawyers and land agents, have been articulating their positions. The mediator's intention is that it is not only them, but importantly, the parties that have been gaining a deeper understanding of where the other is coming from, and to a degree, what are the possibilities. There's been some positions and checking, and also checking out the will of the others to cling to those positions. Each party is looking for signals from the other about how and the degree of movement they can expect from the other. And there's been some flexibility shown by both parties. However, even though they may have got some measure of each other, there still exists this gulf between them. It is at this stage that the mediators move the mediation into what I'm describing as uncharted territory by bringing together Sean and George, two businessmen who have not met before until the opening statements yesterday, but had not had a direct exchange of conversation with each other. Whether it is despite no contact or because of no contact, they have come to this meeting with each believing that the other is getting in the way of their hopes and dreams and that of their respective families. Is this a recipe for conflict to play out between the two in the mediation room? Will this meeting between Sean and George be an impasse trap or the key to unlocking a path to resolution? So before we meet George and Sean with the mediators, we will rerun the pundit poll and invite you to predict once again the outcome of the mediation. The question that will come on your screen is as before. What do you think the outcome of the mediation will be? No settlement, agreement on a 5-year SLDT, agreement on an MLDT, or select something else and use the chat line to tell us what you think might happen. While we are collecting the poll results, I will use the time to tell you about my I and you of mediator characteristics. If you remember, A is for ambiguity. That is being at ease with uncertainty, a sure thing in this next meeting. E is for empathy, for both parties, but without favoring either, a path that mediators need to tread with care. And O is for oneself, that's being oneself. It is vital in building trust. My final two are I and you. I is for insight. And by this, I don't mean that the mediator requires the insight of the problem solver, but rather that the mediator needs to be the catalyst for the parties and their advisors to become the problem solvers. It is like the mediator being a team leader who draws out the potential of the team and triggers or catalyzes the insight of its members. But my I is also for intuition. Mediators make their moves in the moment, often without time for reflection, but based on pattern recognition and judgment honed by experience. It may have been mediators' intuition which led to the tenant and landlord meeting together at this point. My aeiou lexicon ends with U, which is for unturned, in the sense of leaving no stone unturned and being unturned in our resolve to help both parties find resolution. Traits such as tenacity, perseverance, and a belief in the possible, even when others see impasse, lead a mediator to assiduously pursue every and any possibility to help both parties in their search for settlement. So if the meeting between George and Sean doesn't go well, the mediators will be unturned in their resolve to find another way forward. And now we have the poll results on the screen. We're looking back at the day one polls. just to give us some comparison. Comparing these results with yesterday, which see some interesting shifts in opinion. Our armchair pundits who thought that a 5-year SLDT would be the outcome at the end of the opening statements in the first video yesterday shifted almost en bloc to believe that an MLDT would be the outcome by the end of day 1 of the mediation. The something else pundits remained remarkably constant between the 2 polls yesterday. What I like is the huge vote of confidence our delegates all seem to have in mediation, in that only a handful of people forecast no settlement in both polls. And now we come to today's poll. And so we see that the MLDT has shot up to 71%, and the something else has come down. Well, that's a very interesting prediction. And we will be looking forward to the next parts of the video to see whether it's the MLDT or the something else that wins the day. So let's see what happens now in the meeting between George and Sean. The meeting opens with Lindsay explaining the purpose and inviting discussion.
Sean, George, thanks very much indeed for coming together with us. Pamela and I just felt that there comes a time in a mediation, and great progress is being made in this one, when the parties themselves, the people that are most involved, really should have a chance to meet and discuss. And I suppose the discussion is around what really matters to you. And I'm aware that right at the beginning of the mediation, George, you said that you were keen to know what Sean's ambitions were for the farm, and we've kind of not picked up on that yet. And I'm quite sure that Sean has similar questions, or maybe different questions, but also is curious to know about your aspirations, George, and those of your daughter, Megan. It's a conversation. I don't mind which of you kicks off this one.
George, do you want to start the ball rolling?
Yes. Okay, Sean. We don't really know each other, and this is the sort of first occasion we've got to sort of pick each other's brains and try and find common ground and explore what we all want in the short term and also the long term. So I can see that your family's short-term aim is to move into the area, to get possession of the farmhouse, to live there. I understand that. But where I'm not clear about is going forward. I understand that you're willing to consider a 10-year MLDT, which would take me to retirement age. But I'm also thinking of the future of my daughter. She is keen on farming. She's interested in the way we farm, which is an organic farm producing organic potatoes and capable of producing organic vegetables as well. And it's quite a specialist skill in farming, doing that. You can only really do that kind of farming in Scotland in very localized areas where you've got the right type of land and people with the right skills. So looking to the future, I'm interested to know whether there is discussion to be had, and as the mediators have said, look at trying to create a bigger pie to divide up.
So, George, shall I come in, or are you?
Yes, Sean, please do. Yes.
George, thank you very, very much for that. Yes, it is unfortunate we haven't been able to sort of meet face to face due to all the COVID stuff, but it's good to be doing this. I hear loud and clear the skill set that you bring, the organic vegetables, the adding value to that. And I think at the back of my mind, as you're probably aware, yes, the short term, we're trying to move up. My wife is very keen, so she's very keen to move up here with the twins to get us back into the area, but also because of the local school is very much suitable as they're getting to an age where they're moving from the junior to senior school. that's been a big driver for the short term. For the longer term, the aim, the ambition, if you like, has been to try to marry what we have up here with what we have going on south of the border at the hotel that my wife's been very heavily involved in sort of serving very high quality, fun enough organic seasonal cuisine. And there was an idea at the back of our head of trying to marry the two, Pitlochie, the farm, with the hotel and create a symbiosis. And so what we're aware of is, in order to do that, we're looking to have, if you like, more direct input into what we do up here. But to achieve that, we are very much aware that we need to find expertise, we need to find partners to enable us to deliver that. And I think where this process has opened our eyes is the ability to look for an ongoing relationship, which we think has the ability to achieve, hopefully, both aims of yourself, your daughter, and ourselves. So it's been a good process from that front.
So I'm hearing here that that the organic side of the farm and your other business interests, you and your wife's other business interests, Sean, do potentially have quite a lot of synergy. Is that that's really
a lot of synergy? I mean, certainly when you're looking at sort of the restaurant scene within London, organic vegetables with a backstory of provenance and where they come from, etc., is a very good selling point. And that was quite a driver behind what we were trying to achieve.
Yeah. What's your comments on that, George?
It is positive, and you know, I can see that with Sean's willingness, there is a role for both of us to work together going forward. There's a range of produce we can grow on this farm, although at the moment the lease restricts that range, but there's no reason why that, with the consent of Sean, that restriction is lifted going forward, so that we can produce a wider array of organic vegetables for the market or for Sean's enterprise.
Yeah.
In the short term, in terms of looking for living accommodation for everyone, although my family have occupied the farmhouse, going forward, there are 2 other cottages on the farm. My daughter's actually will be moving out soon because she's finishing university and has intentions to get married. So between the other two cottages on the farm, that would be sufficient for myself and my daughter going forward. So I can see that there is a way to resolve all the questions that are up in the air at the moment and try and find a solution that suits. In the long term, I think, as I said, an MLDT for 10 years gets me to retirement, but I'm thinking of my daughter's future. I think in the next 10 years, there is a opportunity for her to demonstrate that she or I are able to farm organically and produce the produce that the market and Sean's other business requires. And I think if we can prove that, then there is a reasonable chance that afterwards there is an opportunity to keep going forward.
Which I think that's exactly right, and that 10 years provides that opportunity. And I think my understanding is Megan has also been at the college doing sustainable food production, so it gives a chance for that skill to develop. And it comes back to what we need as a landlord, if you like, or as a partner, is the expertise to deliver that. We're conscious that we don't have it, and we think that both yourself and Megan do, which helps provide that confidence going forward into the future.
Mm-hmm. One question actually about the cottages. I'm not entirely clear what you're saying, George, that you would be looking to, in one way or another, having the 2 cottages, one for you and one for your daughter. Is that right?
That's possible, yes. so far they've been occupied by staff.
Okay. Just so that you know, I'm hearing some very positive sharing of ambition here. Really great. Obviously, to get to a conclusion at the end of the mediation, there will be the detail to sort out, which is why I was asking about the cottages. Pamela,
Yeah, no, there's great mutuality here, which I think is very encouraging. And you've spoken about the way forward. You've spoken about your short-term and your long-term aims, and they seem to be. This seems to be, as I think the word was synergy that was being used. There seems to be some synergy there, so that's really helpful. Well, I know that there are meetings taking place between the solicitors, and there are also meetings taking place between the two valuers. And we need to hear from them. You need to feedback what you've discussed between yourselves. You've not agreed anything. That's an entirely confidential discussion that you've had. You've not agreed anything at all. But I think it would be helpful to feedback the synergy that you've shown with each other, and your short and long-term aims. And we'll also hear from the valuers and from the solicitors too. And Lindsay and I are going to meet with you privately in your respective rooms in a minute or two. Does that sound fair enough to you both, Sean and George? Yeah, you're not nodding. That's grand. Thank you. Grand. Okay, Lindsay, is there anything else you need to say? No, that's grand. Thank you.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
Maybe you will be thinking that this type of synergistic interchange is only the stuff of fiction. My experience is that it's not uncommon for parties in dispute to find that they have more to gain from collaboration than they have from a standoff. Indeed, potentially, because parties have interests that have collided, looked at in a different way, it is that collision of interests that might hold the potential for collaboration. The mediator's role is to help the parties look below the surface of those interests to explore if there might be a treasure trove of potential, if only we can find the key to unlocking it. But let's not assume all is resolved. There are still differences to be bridged. George and Sean returned to their respective advisors to discuss their next moves. While they may see some potential for collaboration, their advisors may be more cautious about any weakening of what they see as the rights in law or their interests financially. So we now have an enlarged pie, or a broader canvas on which the parties may create ways of resolving the dispute. And it is always easier to find a way to divide an enlarged pie, but it should not disguise that we are now going to move into a serious stage of bargaining. And before we do, I'd like to have a conversation with one of the mediators. Well, welcome, Lindsay.
Hello, good to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I was just saying that some people may think that this synergistic interplay between two adversaries is the stuff of fiction. What's your experience of anything like this ever happening? Bearing in mind, of course, that we need to protect the confidentiality of any parties involved.
Well, I can certainly think of one example where and it is a tenant farmer example, tenant farming example, but that two neighbours, tenant farmer and landlord, had been in very acrimonious dispute for months, years actually, and the initial details of this dispute were around boundaries, access, land, inventories, very familiar territory, if you like. When they got together with us in the mediation, it was a pretty acrimonious early session. And we ended up, as is often the case in mediation, starting to go around in circles, and you get that sense as a mediator that how do we break out of this? It isn't really impasse, it's just we need to break out of this a bit. But it was acrimonious enough for the parties to threaten to, both of them, to walk away from the mediation. So we got to the middle of the morning and both parties are threatening to walk away. Not good, but it happens. Coffee time gave a chance to just individually with them to sort of calm things down and say it's worth sticking with it. But the really interesting breakthrough, I think, was over lunch. Now, this is pre-Zoom days, pre-COVID, but over lunch, the parties got together, and one of the things that I tend to do, I know you tend to do as well, is to use that time to have the parties together, but not to talk about the dispute at all, but to talk about anything but. And it turned out that the farmer and the landlord, they'd known each other for years. There was a long history and it hadn't all been bad. And their children went to the same school. And so they were part of the same community. And there was a lot of really quite easy discussion about that. We got back after lunch and it seemed to be that we were in a more creative space where we really got into what the interests were. And the interests were about the farmer wanting more land to use for arable purposes and the landlord wanting some more land for shooting. And the upshot of it was we got to a land exchange. And land which was not terribly useful for the farmer, needed trees planted. There was a long-term plan there for the tenant farmer, and land that the landlord had came to the tenant farmer. So there was a land exchange which suited both, but it took the time to get the parties actually to come out of their positions and their hostility and realize that they had shared interests, which were about living in a community.
Thank you very much then, Lindsay. It reminded me just what you were saying now. I mean, if we look at the bigger picture outside the world that we're in and farming at the moment, and what's happening in Brexit, we're in a sort of lockdown state. And one of the commentators on this said that the darkest hour comes before dawn. And I think that we often find in mediation that the darkest part of the mediation is just before the breakthrough. And so in some way, these discontinuities, disruptions, and interruptions in the steady state seem to be terribly important.
Yes.
And we, as mediators, I think that we need to have our antennae open to that and to understand when we can help the parties to make use of that type of discontinuity in a very productive way. Anyway, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. And we'll be moving on to my pound diamond again. I mentioned at the beginning that the stages of mediation are not discrete steps, but more a flow system with feedback loops and diversions between the understanding and the negotiation stages. And in this part, we can expect a lot of toing and froing between negotiating, understanding, generating options, enlarging the pie, and sometimes facing impasse traps. So we're now in our pound diamond in this visualization. We're working with the interplay between these two slices of the diamond. The mediators have once again decided to check out the way that the parties are feeling about the state of play in their separate rooms. It's about understanding the newly formed negotiating positions of the parties. And in the next video clip, we will see Lindsay opening the first part of these meetings in the landlord's room.
Thanks very much for coming together again after a short break. Hope everybody's refreshed. We're clearly making, or you're clearly making very good progress, I think. A lot of things are coming together, are being agreed, but there are issues that are not. And I'm sure Pamela will agree with me that this is fairly typical of mediations. You think you're getting on very well, quite a lot of things agreed, and then you get to a stage where you really have to sort out the sticky issues. So what these two meetings that we're going to have, first of all with you and then with George and his colleagues, is to get to the sticky issues and just try and get them not necessarily resolved, but out there on the table, and thinking particularly about what if you don't get to an agreement today? I know everything's looking, you know, hopeful, positive. What happens if you don't? So, Heather, shall I perhaps just hand over to you and see where you and Sean and Mark have got to with the various meetings that we've had?
Yes, I think the tenant is saying that he is unhappy with our rent proposals. So I think that's something that if we are going to reach an agreement, my client's going to have to think about. And I think that we've looked again at the valuation aspects of the cottage, and he seems to be suggesting that actually the two cottages together would have a lesser value than the total improvements claim, to the tune of about £40,000. But then he would be getting two cottages, and it's not just about value, it's about the benefit of residing and having ownership of those properties. So I think we'd probably look for, and also the potato store is not accepted as an improvement. So taking all that into account, I think my client would be willing to transfer title to the two cottages in full and final settlement of the improvements, including the potato store, notwithstanding that small discrepancy in valuation. Is that right, Sean?
Fundamentally, where we got to, I think that we thought that the value of the cottage was slightly larger than we otherwise anticipated, but it does appear to come together with the two cottages. You're absolutely right.
And in respect of the residential accommodation on the farm, I think also I'm right in saying that Sean, although he would prefer to obviously retain the cottages and the farmhouse is so important to Sue and for her plans, the family's plans, that you would probably live with losing the cottages to not have to find the cash to pay for the improvements and to get into that farmhouse just as soon as you can.
Well, the risk we run at the moment is we end up with too much going on at one time, and it becomes it does become quite a cash flow issue. But you're absolutely right. Sue's desire, the need for the kids to be up here is important. It is pressing from our point of view. So if we can get over that hurdle, it can enable us as a family to be more flexible with the aims we're trying to achieve.
And so then the only other thing, if we can persuade the other side to agree with us on all those aspects, the only other thing that we need to think about is the rent. And then I wonder if Mark could give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the rent that we propose has been proposed in a fairly binary fashion, and there's no doubt about it that if we were to get vacant possession, go into the open market, those are the sorts of rents we would be looking at. And I think it's important that everybody understands that, because Sean is giving away, in my view, I think quite a significant rental premium. But I do think we have to take this in the round of everything else that I think you're after, Sean. But I am still very strongly of the view that we need to be looking at a rent at £100 plus per acre. So that's where we are, taking everything in the round. Now, if we take £100 plus per acre, that puts us in at whatever it is, a rent of at least £90,000 for the farm.
Okay, can I just, well, it's summarising for my own purposes really to understand. You are saying that you're offering the two cottages that with a preemptive right to buy if
yes. So from the land
back on the market.
My point of view, we would absolutely be looking for a right of preemption at market value should those cottages ever come onto the market, because they sit right bang heart in the heart of the farm.
Right. Okay. This is me just clarifying, not making any comments about it. You're reckoning that the valuation of the cottages, if that's set against the improvements, that I've written down deficit of 40,000. Does that mean the improvements of the cost of the improvements would be more than the cottages?
They could be, but valuation of cottages is not an exact science, particularly at the moment. And valuation of improvements isn't an exact science either. And we've got this one item, the potato store, which is very much in contention. So what I'm suggesting is that the other side might be prepared to take a view on that, because there's a risk that they wouldn't get the potato store anyway.
Right, so there'd be a reduced payment for the potato store.
So effectively, we would gift the 2 cottages,
yes,
and they would say that that's in full and final settlement of their improvements claim, and there would be no cash flowing from one side to the other. Just be a clean slate.
Right. Okay, I do understand that. And did you say in that what the date of entry to the farmhouse was in this particular proposal?
Well, I think if we are reducing the rent, gifting the cottages, the quid pro quo is early entry to the farmhouse.
Okay.
It's a better,
That is
probably a better deal for the tenant.
And that's also, from a family point of view, from my point of view, that's considerably better.
Just going back to the potato store, which has featured so much in these discussions, I think I understand what you're proposing around that. Early on in the discussions, there was this business about whether they should be farming potatoes at all. Is that something that's no longer an issue?
So if I come at this point, in my discussions with George earlier, we were talking about the future ambitions of the hotel and growing of organic vegetables. My understanding is that the lease didn't allow vegetable growing, but I think going forward in the future, we would be looking to try and establish how we can work more closely together to fulfill both of our ambitions.
Yes, and I take it that's not a difficulty.
Well, it will be a new lease, so it can have new provisions. There are knock-on consequences,
yes,
which I think my client understands.
What are they? What are
Of
What's the
permitting.
knock-on consequences, Heather?
Well, if you permit certain forms of farming under the lease, then the tenant might make an improvement based on that and have a higher improvement claim at the end of the 10-year lease. But again, if the parties are working more closely together, whilst the tenant has statutory rights that he can enforce, Sean rather hopes that in the future the Smiths would come to him if they had any improvements proposals. I mean, they have to give notice anyway, so he rather hopes that they could sort something out together, rather than this rather unsatisfactory position of 10, 20 years down the line looking at what they did historically and various claims out of it.
Again, I think this is sounding positive. Good way forward, as long as George is willing to accept your proposals. What I say again, though, is just when you think things are moving forward, there can be something that just is a bit of a barrier to progress, and it's always important to keep in mind what the prize is and what the alternatives to not getting a settlement may be, because I think you've run through that. You can take the farm back in 4 years' time, I think it is, Sean, but with a lot of aggro, I think, potentially, and also with not getting access to the farmhouse when you want it. But I think we've moved a long way from that scenario, and I hope we'll continue to do so. Thank you for that. Thank you for your frankness about where you've got to. It's very helpful indeed. What Pamela and I will be doing next is going to George's room with his advisors and having a similar sort of discussion. We're not going to be sharing any of the points that you've made here, because we feel that you, Sean, and George, you've made really good progress together in terms of building a relationship, and rather than have a shuttle between the two rooms, we should, after we've been to see George and the others, we should bring you back together and give you the opportunity to actually put what you've said to us directly to George and his colleagues in a joint meeting. So thank you for now.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
See you soon.
Well, let me pause things for a moment before moving to the tenants' room. An interesting episode there. One inexact science set against another inexact science seems to provide the possible solution to the potato store dilemma. As you'll hear at this stage, we're moving towards an agreement. But Lindsay is using the technique of reality testing to remind the party that there's still some way to go to reach agreement. And she asked Sean about the spectre of post-mediation life for him and his family if he and George cannot resolve the differences. This is something that Pamela also picks up when we next move to the tenants' room to see how George and his advisors are feeling about the stage that they have reached.
Well, thank you everybody for this meeting. This is really for Lindsay and I to understand your thinking and things, and to do a bit of reality testing to try and help you think through the various options that are there. I'm sure you've had that conversation already, but it might be helpful just to articulate it again in front of Lindsay and I, and for us to have some input. So the options that were presented, Hamish, I'm looking at Hamish now, the options that were presented by Heather, have you thought about those? I'm sure you have.
We have, Pamela, and we think that they're certainly very worthwhile exploring. They'd be unacceptable, both options, in their present forum, but we think that there is an agreement to be made based on the proposals that have been made.
Okay. Can you go on? This is confidential, so can you go on and
Sure.
tell us a little bit about?
So we think that giving up the farmhouse as early as the date requested by the other side is unrealistic for practical reasons. And we think that it would be more easily achievable at the 28th of May, but that we would be happy to allow the other side to have access to carry out surveys and so on and so forth. That wouldn't be a problem. We quite like the idea of a modern limited duration tenancy to be followed by a contract farming agreement. I think our preference would be that the MLDT should be for 15 years, and that the option to take up the contract farming agreement should also be an option to take up any joint venture that the landlord decides to promote in respect of an agricultural business on the farm, because it may not be contract farming that the landlord decides to do. It may be some other agricultural business activity involving a partner. So we want to have the first option to take up that opportunity, whatever it might be. That's an issue that I had flagged with Heather, so the other side should be aware of that. We like the idea of a cottage coming back, but we don't think one cottage on its own is enough.
Is it both cottages you're looking for?
Looking for both cottages, in order to write off the improvements. And we're very unhappy about the rental figures that have been suggested in both proposals. Actually, we think that they're far too high, having regard to the true rental value of the holdings. And perhaps Tom can say a bit more about that.
Yeah, that'd be helpful, Tom. Could you come in and tell us about the rental that you would suggest might be appropriate?
Moving on to the rent, I think the figures that were passed forward by Heather, I think discussion with Mark, we weren't quite sure exactly how she got to that global figure of 150,000. I think there was some adjustment that needs to be done there to be a more realistic proposal. But certainly the rent where it is at the moment is just shy of 60,000. and to move to that magnitude of where the proposing is, bearing in mind the current conditions, is agricultural economic conditions, is going to be a very, very big shift. So I think that is a point of discussion where we need to move further on from.
So what are you actually suggesting might be the rent that you would be seeking here?
Well, I think as an open discussion where we've come to with the three of us is really we probably think a rental standstill should apply. There's a lot of other factors coming into this that we think do have some high degree of relevance there, and also there is the opportunity for continuity of what I believe now is acknowledged of George's ability to farm the farm in a very, very good order.
Yeah, so it's quite a jump up. Yeah, okay. Can I ask you all to think about what would happen? I mean, I hear very much your proposal that you're putting forward. What happens if you don't get what you're looking for, George? What's your alternative, do you think?
Then if we can't reach an agreement, my alternative is to extend the tenancy for 3 years in my name, which is a procedure for a limited partnership. So that would, having spoken to Sean, I realised that him and his wife are really pretty keen to get access to the house now and move their family up now because their kids are at a critical schooling stage. So if I was to delay by 3 years, I think that would be a major inconvenience to their plan, from what I understand from speaking to Sean.
And do you think that would help you to be a major inconvenience to them?
Sorry?
Do you think that was going to help you to be a major inconvenience to them?
I think I'm bargaining from a position of some strength now that I know what they want, and they're wanting something that I have to agree to give. There should be a bit of give and take on both sides, but that is my default position, to simply stay in the farm.
To stay in it.
Years. Yeah.
What happens if is it 4 years' time that you just decide that Sean is not going to agree to anything that you suggest, and you just out in your ear? Is that what happens?
Can I come in there?
Yes, please do, Hamish.
The legal position is that the landlord is able to secure vacant possession, subject to George serving a counter notice to the notice terminating the limited partnership, recovering vacant possession in 3 years' time from 28th November
3 years, right.
2020. So George is in a position to remain in occupation legitimately until the 28th of November 2023.
Right.
We will see through the amnesty procedure to qualify the various improvements for compensation at the end of the tenancy. It does appear that we will have a dispute about the tatty shed, but it's sufficient value to make that worthwhile resolving through the land court if we have to. What George would be concentrating on is just maximising the amount of compensation that he can get and maximising the profit that he can make from continuing farming operations until 28th November 2023. That's our bottom line. We want to achieve something much better, and we want to achieve something with a degree of goodwill on the part of both sides. But if the gloves were off, that's where we would inevitably end up.
Yeah, I hear that.
But that's not where we want to be with this at all.
Okay.
But George is right in identifying that if the landlords do want early access to the farmhouse in particular, there's got to be something coming back to us.
Okay.
And bear in mind, they proposed the MLDT followed on by a contract farming agreement.
It did indeed, yeah.
And that is a very creative suggestion, and one that we've reacted positively to.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, so where you are is there are proposals that you would like to make to the other side. Is that where we are? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and Hamish, would you like to make them, or is it for George and Tom to make them? Who do you think would be suitable to make them?
I think that I should make the proposal, but defer to Tom to discuss the rental value, because he's got a better grip of that than I do, to be perfectly honest with you. But I can talk about the other aspects.
Would it be possible and sensible that Hamish and I met with both Heather and Mark so we could join that thinking up a wee bit as the
It's an extra thought, isn't it? Yeah. And have a little bit of a discussion about how you're going to put some flesh in the bones. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we can certainly suggest that to Heather and to Mark, and indeed to Sean as well. That would leave you, George, sitting in this room on your own. Is that okay? I'm sure you've got things you could do. Yeah.
Well, we're now at an important juncture in the mediation with some breakthrough ideas on the table and the potential to be dividing up an enlarged pie between George and Sean. This is a good point to think about what has been happening in both the mediation conversations and the private conversations of the parties with their advisors. And I would like to invite Heather and Lindsay to have a discussion. Heather and Lindsay, thanks very much for joining me. I mentioned between the last two clips that the mediators were using the technique of reality testing. Funnily enough, it's often when a negotiation has seemingly achieved a breakthrough that there may need to be some tempering of people's perceptions, which can overestimate the likelihood of success in the new terms. Of course, it's not just the mediators that have a role in supporting parties in their assessment of realities. The advisors, both land agents and lawyers, are there to assist their clients to assess the reality of what is on the table and what their walkaway realities might be. In conversation, I wonder if you'd like to tell me a little about your respective roles in this valuable part of the mediation process.
Robin, can I start off by asking Heather a question? Heather, you're a solicitor and you are also a mediator. What's your view of what's the difference when you're mediating or when you're the solicitor acting for your party?
I think it's a difference between explaining the reality when you're a solicitor, and we saw Hamish doing that with his client. And Hamish was summarising, I think, both for the benefit of the mediator, but in response to a very open question. But then his client was getting the benefit of listening to all of that again. When we're dealing with these very complicated agricultural holdings issues, it's not unusual for a client not to really understand what's going on the legal side, and perhaps to miss something of significance in terms of the worst that could happen and the best that could happen. And then to understand what the priorities are in reaching some sort of agreement if they can. I think it's a really, really useful tool. It's one of the great benefits of qualifying both in mediation training and in legal training, to use that type of questioning and that type of reality checking. I use it all the time with court work because it's just really, really helpful. But for the client, it's really hard work. And it's one of the most difficult stages of the mediation for the client, because the client has to do all the work. They're the ones that have to make the decisions, and they have to take responsibility for either reaching a compromise or going to their best case or their worst case or somewhere in between. And that's the key difference with mediation, is the client is really taking ownership of that decision.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised the best case and the worst case, and I think many people, particularly solicitors and mediators, are used to BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and WATNA, the worst, and the way that we go through that. I mean, in some ways, I feel that I can't speak for what it's like to be a solicitor, but I can speak about being a mediator, and it goes back to something that Pamela said right at the outset of all of this about impartiality or multi-partiality. For the mediator, we're actually on both sides, if you like. And one of the things that occurred to me, we tend to do reality testing in private session, which we demonstrated here. But there's also some benefit of doing it in joint session, so that the parties can actually hear each other's perspective, although I guess that that can be a more tricky situation. I don't know if you have any experience of doing that in joint session.
I don't, and I think my inclination as a solicitor would be to protect my client from that, unless it was a client who was very well briefed, lest they should say something that undermines their negotiating position in the mediation. But I can see in some cases it might work, but as a solicitor, I'd be very cautious about that.
Well, that's very interesting, because I think that might be one of the key differences in the two perspectives. Robin, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I suppose thinking about the possibilities in joint session, the parties may do some of the reality testing for each other, and what the mediator is doing is facilitating a conversation. And I think the other thing that I have in my mind is that the mediator comes to it from the point of view of curiosity, whereas the solicitor comes from the point of view of giving good advice to their client. And I think those are two slightly different perspectives that come into it. Anyway, that was a super conversation. Thank you very much for joining me. We need to move on now. And so on to the next point, and it's back to my pound diamond. We are less in the understanding negotiating interplay now, and more in the what you might say is the firmly in the negotiating stage. So before going into that stage in the video, I would like to tell you something about principled negotiation. Mediators, and lots of people, negotiators, often turn to a book by Roger Fisher and William Ury when learning about principled negotiation. Fisher Ury wrote Getting to Yes 40 years ago when they were members of the Harvard Negotiation Project. They both became international mediators and gurus in their field. This book is a short read, but it has become a standard work in the field of negotiation. It describes 4 steps in non-adversarial bargaining, and these remain key elements in a negotiator and mediator's toolbox. The first is focus on interests and not positions, and this has been a constant theme of the role play you've been watching, and so I'm not going to say any more about it. The second area is inventing options for mutual gain. Likewise, we've had a great play of generating options and increasing the size of the pie. Mediation is not a zero-sum game. Separating the people from the problem is my third area here. And this has been a very respectful dialogue in this mock mediation. On a dial with a scale from 1 to 10 of emotional content of the mediations I've experienced, I would put this down at 2. And at 9, you can be doing a lot of calming things down so the problem can be addressed. But emotional content is not only the people problem. It can be about different perceptions and ineffective communications, which can all hinder our grasp of the real problem. And the fourth area is insisting on using objective criteria. There may not have been much that illustrates that in this mock mediation, but we could take paying for the amnesty improvements as an example. First, there was an in-principle agreement about the improvements being paid for by property transfer in place of money changing hands. And then the property was professionally valued by the land agents, and they changed the view from it being the value of 1 cottage to it being the value of 2 cottages that would be equivalent to writing a check for all the improvements. So we move on to the stage of negotiating. We'll find the mediators meeting with the lawyers and the land agents in a joint room, but without their clients. We'll be joining the meeting as Lindsay invites Hamish to start the ball rolling on what she describes as the crunchy discussion points.
Well, thanks all of you again. Thank you for coming together. I think we're getting to a stage where there are crunchy discussion points, and I think I'm going to ask Hamish just to to start off, to get the ball rolling. Would you like to do that, Hamish?
Yes, of course, Lindsay. I think that from George and Tom and I's point of view, we think that there has been good progress, and the discussions that have taken place today have really been quite encouraging. I think we're at the stage now of formally responding to the proposals that Heather had outlined in her email to me, and which were touched on in the general discussion. And in principle, we would be prepared to accept a modern limited duration tenancy followed by a first option in respect of a contract farming agreement. In fact, we would like first option on any sort of joint venture agricultural enterprise that the landlord proposes to carry on the farm after the end of the MLDT. Our preference would be that the MLDT was for an initial period of 15 years, so not the 10 years that was initially proposed. We are attracted by the idea of property changing hands as a means of compensating the improvements claim. However, what we would like to achieve is to have the 2 cottages on the farm conveyed to us, and that would be in full and final settlement of the full value of the compensation that otherwise would be payable in respect of the improvements. The values coincidentally more or less match if the potato shed is included in the equation. The other issue, of course, is the rental value going forward, and we would we're not prepared to agree to the rental levels that are proposed at the moment, and I'll ask Tom just to flesh out our position on that as soon as I finish my remarks. The other point is that the early date of entry, we do want to accommodate the landlord so far as that's concerned, and we do understand the landlord's wishes, but from a practical point of view, it will be very, very difficult for us to achieve that handover date, and we'd like to propose that the handover would be 28th May 2021, but with full access allowed to the landlord throughout to carry out surveys and measurements and so on. And Tom is going to say something about the rent.
Yeah, just there was, I think there's a wee bit of confusion from our point of view as to what the actual rental proposal coming forward was. Mark and I had some further discussion on that one, but just to sort of give you an idea where we're coming from on the rent. Long discussion with George about the economics, etc., and basically the productive capacity of the farm will not be altering really. The same fixed equipment there, albeit change of ownership. So the feeling was that our proposal would consist of a rental standstill. The current rent we're passing is 58,500, i.e. £65 an acre. But we feel there is a strong thought and desire that would be maintained at that level going forward, and there's continuity of the people actually farming the ground as well.
Anything else from you, Hamish, at this point?
Lindsay, thank you. Nothing further at this stage.
Well, I think Heather and Mark. Heather, perhaps first of all, what's your response to those remarks?
Well, thank you very much for that. We do seem to be getting closer. I obviously don't have client instruction, but I can probably make a few comments as to what I anticipate those being, or points that might require further discussion if we can't sort something out just now. One point that we haven't discussed recently, which remains important, is that we have some sort of agreed media statement. Is that, can I take it that will be included, Hamish?
If we reach a landing on all of this, Heather, yes, that would be agreed.
Okay, that's great, thank you. So the two other, aside from the rent, which I will also pass on to to my client's expert in that area. The only other 2 points are the 15 years rather than 10. I anticipate that being a problem for my client. It took quite a bit of work on our side to push him up from 5 to 10. And so I would ask you to have a think about that one. And also the 28th of May entry date. When I first outlined our proposals at the start of today, a 28th of May entry date was based on one set of factors, and a more immediate entry date was based on another. And we are much closer to that other set of conditions and other points being agreed. And so I think that the quid pro quo for that needs to be early entry. I might be able to do something around the dates, perhaps, again, speaking without instructions, after Christmas rather than before Christmas. But I don't think I could push my client much further than that. Mark, do you want to comment on the rents just now?
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, we are much closer, and Tom and I think we've had some productive discussions. Just for the avoidance of doubt, we are at £100 an acre for a new MLDT against I think what you're proposing, Tom, is a standstill. I mean, I've got a real difficulty with a standstill in advising my client, and I think you've said it, Tom. It's the same fixed equipment, but it's a change of ownership. And yeah, it is a change of ownership. The landlord now owns that fixed equipment and is entitled to some rent. So, I think we've got some real difficulty in moving forward at £65 an acre, because there's nothing in it. So I think unless there's some movement there, we have a bit of an impasse.
If I can jump in there, I think, look, in all honesty, where we're coming from this is, I think there's a huge amount going on here, and I don't think anyone's necessarily hung up about the rent. I would say that, obviously subject to George's instruction, but I'm fairly sure that he would be happy for us to say that there is more than certainly a degree of ability to move from the position of a standstill if needs be, if these other items are brought into the mix as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's helpful.
Could I maybe just comment at this moment in time? I'm aware that there's a restriction on certain types of farming in the present lease. I understand that you'd have to enter into a new lease going forward. Is that something that the landlord has considered, lifting the restriction so that there can be, because there was some discussion between George and Sean about organic farming.
Yes, it would be a new lease, so we could put a new provision in. I can't imagine that being a major stumbling block. And if it's of help, the other points, conveying the 2 cottages rather than the 1 would be acceptable.
I mean, if I can add, Heather, I mean, I think lifting that restriction actually works in everybody's favour. After all, the landlord's now providing potato store. And it meets the landlord's agenda of farm to fork and all of that. So yeah, I don't see that as being a difficulty. It's down to Tom and I on rent, and I think providing we get everything that we want as outlined by Heather, then it's probably going to be a classic compromise.
Sorry, come in, Hamish.
Pamela, thank you. If I can come in there, I think that we're likely to be able to bring forward the date that we would be able to give up the farmhouse, but I don't think we can achieve the date that you'd originally fixed. But suggesting that it might be sometime after Christmas, essentially sometime during January, we might be able to do something about that. And I will need to take client instruction on 10 years rather than 15 years.
Okay. You mentioned, Mark, compromise. I mean, I think...
Well,
starting to see the areas of compromise, almost the sliding scales. You've got, is it 10 years, 15 years or something in between? I don't know if it can be something in between. You've got the date of entry that's negotiable. You've got the rental values, which clearly need some more discussion, but certainly starting to make good progress and seeing where those negotiations have to happen. And always bearing in mind, and I know you are, the alternative to this is not reaching an agreement, which at this stage in the discussions would seem a really very sad, sad thing.
Absolutely, and I think this is about a partnering relationship going forward. It has to be about a partnering relationship going forward. And I think on that basis, I would be prepared to go back to Sean, and I think our walkaway position is £80 an acre.
Okay, Tom, what's your reaction to that, if you feel able to give one?
In all honesty, that bearing in mind the bigger picture, I would imagine that George will probably squeal slightly at that, saying how we're going to make extra money. But nevertheless, I think there is a bigger picture to look at. I think, in fairness, as a degree of compromise, I think that's something that I would be happy to take back to him. I think the good thing about it, actually, it may provide a basis where all parties can go forward together and get over this hump which they've got into, slight by default. But it may provide an opportunity for all.
Well, if we're both squealing, is it working?
Yes, probably. So if I can just quickly summarize before you go back to your clients to just check this out. There's a negotiation around the length of the tenancy, and I think, Hamish, you said you'd take back to George that particular issue. There's the date of entry to the cottages, with Hamish suggesting, hasn't taken instruction, but suggesting that after Christmas, perhaps rather than the end of November, would be more practical. So that's something perhaps, Heather, for you to take back to Sean. And then we've got a suggestion from Tom and Mark that they'll make both of their clients squeal by suggesting 80, but they'll see how it will go.
£80 an acre.
80, yes, 80 an acre. I haven't done the sums of the overall thing. And there was also agreement about the media statement. If we get to, hopefully we will get to a conclusion. Pamela, is there anything else at the moment that we should be?
No, that sounds like a very helpful summary altogether. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's you back to your clients, and then we're going to come together in a joint meeting where we'll ask you, if you're prepared to do that, to just put the, if you like, the heads of agreement forward before Hamish and Heather have the hard work to do of pulling together, I hope we'll get there, pulling together a formal agreement. So thank you very much.
And so the advisors retire to the rooms where it seems that they will have both of their clients squealing. As mediators, we're looking probably for outcomes that are acceptable, the parties can live with. It's not happiness that we're trying to achieve. That's an optional extra. We now arrive at the last segment of my pound diamond, deciding. After the last session, we may have an array of options and alternatives which are partially agreed. The preferred options need to be firmed up so they can represent outcomes, and each outcome needs to be narrated in some detail. Not every legal document which is a product of the mediated agreement can be prepared immediately, but the resolution needs to be written in sufficient detail so that there is certainty of what is needing to happen, when it will take place, and by whom the action will be implemented. But before an agreement can be produced, there may be still some differences to resolve, and the mediators have some work to do to assist the parties with their negotiations. The big picture is looking promising, but there will be details on each side's position that need to be aligned. And this can often be assisted by shuttle negotiation led by the mediators. We will now join the two parties and the four advisors in the joint mediation room after this has happened. And Pamela invites Hamish to lead off by outlining his understanding of what has been agreed.
Okay, thank you everybody for agreeing to be here. There's been quite a lot of toing and froing in the private rooms and with Lindsay and I. I think we do have largely agreement. Hamish, would you like to come in now and just say what you understand has been agreed between you and Heather? Because then that will move things on a little bit, I think.
Yes, of course, Pamela, thank you. The outline heads of terms are that the parties will enter into a modern limited duration tenancy for a period of 10 years. And there will be an agreement that if the landlord decides to farm the farm via a joint enterprise of any sort, that George and his daughter are given first opportunity to take up that joint enterprise. That the 2 cottages are conveyed by Sean to George, and that writes off the value of the tenant's claim for compensation for agricultural improvements, and that the rent for the MLDT going forward will be a sum of £72 per acre.
Yeah.
That the farmhouse be returned to the landlord not later than the 31st of January 2021, and that the parties will enter into an agreed statement to be issued publicly, essentially saying that they've reached an amicable agreement that allows George and his daughter to remain on the farm.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Hamish. Is that agreed, Heather?
I think so. Mark, the rent is the rent.
Yeah.
72,000.
Can we correct the rent? It's another sharp practice going on here. £72,000 per annum, not per acre.
I'm sorry, that was entirely my mistake. I'm sorry about that. £72,000 per annum.
Okay. And are you happy with that, Tom?
Yes,
that's grand. That's grand. Good. So that's what you've agreed in outline. Has any work been done on the PR statement that's going to be made to the press, I think?
We've made a bit of a start about what we want that to look like, and we'll flesh it out in the settlement agreement in due course.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. Thank you for that. And Sean and George, you've had meetings with each other, obviously, and you've had the opportunity to say things to each other. Is there anything you want to say just as we finish up, just as we close? Because now it will be for the solicitors to put what they have agreed into writing. Is there anything you want to say to each other?
Pamela, I think just to say thank you both to George, but to everybody else for all the work they put into this and being able to come together to a constructive agreement that we can have forward into the future.
Thank you, Sean. George.
Yeah, I think it's been constructive. When I started this mediation process, I thought I didn't really have a leg to stand on, but I've discovered that there were things that I had that I could offer and use as, for want of a better word, bargaining chips. And I think between myself and Sean, we've worked out how to create, as in your words as the mediator, a bigger piece of cake to divide up. And looking at the short term and the long term, we've seemed to have resolved it all to a certain extent. And I feel as though I am now in a better position and place looking to the future than I was at the start of this session.
That's great. I'm really encouraged to hear you both say that. Lindsay, would you like to say something?
Well, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for your very constructive approach to what at the beginning did look pretty difficult issues, and particularly thanks to George and Sean for the way that you have come together and understood each other's position, and that's great. And I wish you, that's particularly George and Sean, all the very best moving forward in what I hope will be working together in future. So I think, Pamela, you and I, we've learned a lot, as
Yeah.
we always do, and enjoyed working with you. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody.
There we have it. George has managed to convert my enlarged pie into a larger piece of cake. And so it seems the parties have had their cake and they can eat it. And the Pitlochie Farm dispute is over. And the mediation has finished, or has it? Hamish has narrated the key terms of the agreement. And after a bit of adjustment by Heather and Mark, they have confirmed that they are in agreement. Although the mediators wrap things up at this point, that is really just for the camera. And we don't leave a mediation with oral agreements. The next job is to commit the agreement, or indeed agreements, to writing. This is not necessarily a simple and quick task. I've been in mediations where after a 16-hour day, we reached an agreement just before midnight and decided to reconvene the following day to what we thought was 2 hour maybe, writing up of the agreements. As the detail was being framed between the parties, solicitors, it became clear that it was not going to be a straightforward day, and the mediators were involved in another 16-hour day, helping the parties to reach a watertight conclusion. You might remember that in the pre-mediation meeting, the mediators recommended that the lawyers agree between them a boilerplate or skeletal agreement that could be used to fill in the terms. But back then, it couldn't have been predicted which type of lease might result, and that a conveyance of property would pay for the amnesty improvements. A heads of terms might well be the way to commit the mediation agreement to writing. And in the information pack, there is a boilerplate settlement agreement on which we have summarized 5 key terms of the agreement. And that is up in front of you at the moment. The heads of terms has a set of general terms and blanks for the specific terms, which as this document scrolls down, you will see has a few simple statements to summarize the key areas of mock mediation agreement. For the purpose of this webinar, we are leaving it at that. However, in my experience, it's highly unlikely that such simple statements would be all that was in the agreement at the end of the mediation. And it is both likely and advisable that more detail about how each term will be delivered goes into the heads of terms. The risk, if more of the detail is not sorted out during the mediation, is that it will open up a whole series of areas for further negotiation down the line when the lawyers get down to preparing the more detailed agreements. I would now like to invite John to join me and hand over to him for the next part of the webinar.
Thank you, Robin. A great outcome. And I think with MLDT, some sort of joint venture option, the 2 cottages being conveyed, writing off the improvements as a result, the rent agreed and the farmhouse entry date agreed and a joint statement agreed. We've had something that everybody had mentioned in the poll. So the people in the poll who said there was something else, the people in the poll who said it would be an MLDT, everyone can give themselves a pat in the back for working out this particular whodunit. So well done to everyone. I do think that you'll all agree that the mock mediation you've just seen has been a terrific advert, not just for mediation, but for the process of having mediation online as well. A great outcome. But before we move on to the Q&A, we've got one final poll, this one in 2 parts. The first part, having seen this mock mediation and learned more about the process, are you now more or less inclined to suggest mediation to a client, colleague, or friend? So if you can fill that one in. There's a part 2, as I say. So once this removes off the screen. And part 2, if you are suggesting mediation, are you more likely to suggest online mediation or in-person mediation? So again, look forward to seeing the outcome of that. So now moving on to the Q&A. As a first question, I thought I would ask Hamish, while it's fresh in our minds. Robin said a lot there about the settlement agreement. Can you say something, Hamish, about how you agree a settlement mediation agreement at the end of a long day of mediation, in the knowledge that if it's left to tomorrow, the views of the parties may have changed?
Advanced preparation helps a lot so far as that's concerned, John. If it's possible to predict, at least in some way, what the likely outcome will be, it's possible to do some very general drafting in advance for the documents that might be required. I suspect in this mediation it would have been quite tricky because the outcome that the parties eventually agreed, I think, would have been difficult to predict at the outset, and plainly documenting the agreement fully would take quite a long time. So the legal advisors really have to put their heads together and get a reasonably comprehensive set of heads of terms put in place that the parties can sign off on at the close of the proceedings. Sometimes where the issues are much narrower and the likely outcome is clearer from the outset, you can do a bit more drafting in advance.
Thanks, Hamish. And Robin, do you have anything to add to that about the urgent need, if you like, to get the agreement signed at the end of the session?
I mean, the only thing, I completely agree with everything that Hamish said and defer to him in this sort of thing. I just think it's so important to try to work out the details and put them in. So some of the sort of blanket statements that we saw in that heads of terms, I don't think would be satisfactory, because it could open up issues, as I was saying, further down the line when we're trying to, or the solicitors are trying to put together the detailed agreements.
Thanks, Robin. Now, this mock mediation was originally intended to have been in person in the spring of this year, and has ultimately appeared on Zoom, which has led to its own issues. But I think, in fact, it would have been very difficult to have done what we've achieved over the last 2 days on Zoom in person in a lecture theatre. But one of our delegates has asked a question, Lindsay, that about your discussion earlier about the sharing of coffee and lunch, where the parties speak about things other than their differences. So what in the days of Zoom is your substitute strategy in that context?
Well, I'm glad that question has been asked, because had there been time, I might have said something about the fact that we don't have that opportunity now. I think there are trade-offs, and we've talked about them a bit during the course of the mock mediation, haven't we? That Zoom allows us to set things up more easily. It means that we don't have to find a venue, people don't have to travel, and we're getting really pretty good results. Where a fractured relationship is at the root of the dispute, and this isn't just about the farming sector, this is about many other sectors, actually having people together and breaking bread is a very important part of things. And I don't know, I mean, Robin might have a view about how we managed to do it on Zoom. I don't think we can in quite the same way. I mean, we can do our best to get relationships forged, as we demonstrated, I hope, by getting Sean and George together. But Robin may have a view.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are some things we can do by getting the parties together in the separate rooms that we can set up all sorts of combinations of rooms, so that sort of thing can help. But I think that we maybe should project a little further forward into the time when we are not restricted to meeting people. And in those circumstances, I think we're going to find that mediation will move to a blended model, which will involve more of this type of video conversation and also meetings. A lot of these are Lindsay, in my experience, a lot of the success of mediation in terms of the rapport and the building of trust happens in the build up to the mediation, not the bits you see. It happens when we meet people. Now, I think we might have commented earlier that in the days of Zoom, we're starting to use the opportunity of going through a familiarization session with people to get to know them a little. Well, before that, we used to go and meet the farmer on the farm and the landlord in his boardroom or whatever. And so we were having direct contact, but we could still then put the mediation together on Zoom for the convenience of getting all the parties together. So I think we might find a blended model will find our way to something.
That's interesting. Thank you both. And sticking with you, Robin, our mediation, of course, reached an amicable outcome. Can you say roughly how many mediations or what percentage of mediations do reach a satisfactory outcome, an agreed solution? And if you know, how does that compare with litigation?
It is a high proportion. It's around the 4 out of 5. 4 out of 5 is often quoted. I think that looking at some of the sort of, if you're unpacking that a little, in complaints and court case, if you're talking about small claims, which are a bit like sort of complaint type cases, it might be around the 75%. In commercial, right. I think it tends to be over the 80, maybe at 90. And so you're getting sort of a range around that.
Good, thank you.
The second part of your question.
The second was comparing it with court, but I appreciate it's a different outcome because a court process ultimately reaches a decision that isn't necessarily satisfactory.
I think the only comment I'd make on that is compliance. And I can only tell you about what I've heard from small claims courts. The compliance in small claims courts, where the sheriff makes a decision, seems to be around 60%. In the mediations, it's nearly 100%.
That's interesting, yes. Question for Heather now. When mediations fail, what happens? If the mediation today had not reached an agreed outcome, what would the next step for the parties be?
Well, ultimately, we could have ended up with someone's best or worst case scenario outcome, but you very much hope that when parties have gone to the effort of engaging in mediation, that changes their mindset in terms of their future engagement with one another. And I've seen it happen that parties have come back for more mediation at a future date and reached a resolution then. I've seen it happen that the solicitors pick up the phone to each other and reach some agreement following further instruction and further consideration by the parties. Sometimes the parties genuinely need more time. Sometimes they will say to you at the close or towards the close of the mediation, I'm not going to do a deal today, but that does not mean that I'm not engaged with the process and I don't want to do a deal. It means I need more time and I need to think through these issues, or perhaps I need to go and ask someone else for their opinion within a family setup, for example. So just because a mediation doesn't resolve on the day doesn't categorize it as a failure, I would say.
Good, thank you. Lindsay, going back to the position before a mediation, what do you do if one party is keen to try mediation but the other isn't? It presumably takes two to mediate.
It takes two to mediate. So if one is saying no, it's a pretty difficult thing to get to mediation. However, it's not unusual for one party to be more enthusiastic about it than the other, in which case I think my role is to spend some time with the party who is less enthusiastic, just answering questions about mediation, explaining what it's about. I mean, it's just finding out why are they less enthusiastic? What is it that they're worried about? So it's about answering answering questions. It might be, I really don't like this person at all, and I don't want to be in the same space as them. And then we can talk about how that can be managed.
Thank you. Heather, a question on costs. How do the legal and other costs of a mediation compare with those of going to court?
I noticed there was a delegate had posted a similar question.
Yes.
If you are asking a mediation process and the land court to determine one issue, then the cost would be broadly comparable. However, what we have to remember is that most, if not all, mediations are resolving more than one legal issue. We saw that today. So although your initial cost for a process involving all your professional advisors and an independent service is broadly comparable, in the longer term, usually you're saving cost because you're resolving everything in the one forum rather than, I think I said at some point during the mock, we could have ended up with a few different litigations and a few other points which either just couldn't be resolved or wouldn't be resolved. So that's why people say that mediation is more cost effective, rather than that the actual day itself being cheaper.
Thank you. And do you think it's any cheaper when it's online?
I don't know that one. I think I would defer to Robin and Lindsay on that one.
Or maybe Robin would like to input on that.
There are some savings. It could be the premises that one holds it in. If you're trying to find a neutral premises, you'll have a hotel or something like that, and the costs associated with that. I think we have tended to notice that the length of time in mediations is slightly shorter. People are not up for a 16-hour day. Maybe that's a good thing for other reasons. But I don't see the cost changing a lot. One of the things that might be an opportunity, though, in the future is to try to get involved in mediating disputes earlier. And I wonder if disputes that come up in the farming field, but in all sorts of areas, could be picked up in mediation at the stage when they could be more like a half-day mediation or something that is a bit shorter, possibly with less requirement for all the professionals to be involved and more about a direct negotiation between the principals. So there may be ways that could be done with advice being given to the parties by their advisors in a way that is more cost effective.
Thank you.
Just
one
point on expenses, John, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There is one way in which mediation can be very much cheaper, which is that you're not at risk of being on the losing side in formal court proceedings and having the expenses awarded against you.
Yes.
And just thinking about our mediation, the only real dispute I think that would have ended up in the land court would have been in relation to compensation for improvements, because without an agreement, George would have had to have served an amnesty notice, which would have been objected to, and then the parties would have litigated principally on the question of the tatty shed. The future of the limited partnership, George's ability to serve a counter notice, and the subsequent notices to quit, those were all relatively straightforward and not much scope for dispute, quite honestly.
Thank you. Well, one for you, Lindsay. It's come from the delegates. Why were the landlord and tenant not involved in the crunchy negotiation session?
Very good question. I think that's a judgment call from the mediators. We decided to go with the advisors in that discussion. I might well have had the parties in there as well. It's just a balance of how you want to play it. So, but I think some mediators are more comfortable with working particularly with the advisors at that stage, and others would have the parties involved. So I'm sorry if that's a bit of a fudge, but reasonable question. Don't know if Robin wants to say anything there.
Well, I was saying, I think that what we were trying to do through the mock mediation was show different things happening, different approaches to things. What you'll find is that some mediators will tend to do more with joint meetings, and others will tend to do more through shuttles diplomacy. So I tend to lean more for the joint meeting. I know Pam tends to lean more in the direction of shuttle, and I think it's about style.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question that's a very general one, Robin. How would you suggest getting involved in mediation? Is there a particular training qualification required?
Yes, there is. There's a number of organisations in Scotland that provide certificated courses in mediation. They're usually a 5-day, 6-day course with a 2-day assessment, and that would give you a certificate in mediation. And after that, if you can find the opportunity to be an assistant mediator and help to carry out mediations, or get involved in the small claims court mediations, you start to get the experience, and then you can register with Scottish Mediation to be on the Scottish Register of Mediators. So that's broadly the approach. The range of organisations that are providing mediation training are from the type of organisation that provides commercial training, commercial mediator training, workplace mediation training, through to community training. And there's also an organisation in Scotland that's providing training in multi-party disputes or civic mediation. And we haven't talked at all about something which is a bit more complicated than just having two disputing parties. But in the environmental issues, the planning issues, you can have many different parties, many different interests involved in mediating a solution.
You mentioned the Register of Mediators held by, I think, with Scottish Mediation, you said. What does that tell you? I think one question we've been asked is, how do I find a mediator and know their level of expertise? Does it tell you about the mediator on that register?
Yes, it does. The register, and people could go online and have a look at it. It gives you the name, the experience of the mediator, the contact information for them, and then depending on how much information they've put on that register, you can also find out from them about their training and the sort of experience in the types and the numbers of mediations that they've done, and you can go on to find out more about them, that sort of thing.
Thank you. Lindsay, how long does the whole process take generally from selecting the mediator in the way that Robin's just described to the settlement agreement being signed?
Well, it's probably a bit shorter if you're using Zoom, because you don't have the complication of getting everybody together in one place and the venue and so on. But if you were to approach me today and say, I've got this problem, can we mediate? I'd be looking at my diary, they'd be looking at theirs, and if both parties was agreeable to do it, this is a two-party, no advisors sort of mediation, then we could set it up within a few days with the familiarization sessions and so on. What I actually find is people come along and they say, I want this done as soon as possible. You know, what's your availability in the next week? And then it actually takes quite a long time for them to come back and to think about it. And of course you have the problem of one person thinks they want to mediate and the other party doesn't. So there's, but really, you know, it depends on the availability of everybody concerned.
Yeah, thank you. One question that we've been asked, which I think is perhaps out with the scope of this webinar, but it's a good question nonetheless. What thoughts do you have on how the landlord and tenant relationship might be able to improve and positively be sustained going forward after such a successful mediation? And how might they go about communicating and cooperating more effectively in future? So I think that's a good idea, and something it's maybe a bit unfair to ask specific questions about how we do that going forward. But Hamish, do you have any ideas about the landlord-tenant relationship and how that can be sustained?
Well, I suppose if we think about Sean and George, they've now met each other for the first time, and they will be living in close proximity to each other. So ordinary social contact, I would have thought, will help develop that relationship. Where that's not possible, then regular personal communication of some sort, even on a very sort of superficial level, can help promote positive relationships going forward. But it'll be horses for courses, and no one set of rules would apply in all circumstances, I don't think.
Thank you. And just to finish off the Q&A, I think there's one question we've been asked that I think sums up the great success of this webinar. What are the plans to further publicise the huge benefits of mediation, and which groups will lead in this? Robin, would you like to say something about that to finish off the Q&A?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, one of the banners under which we produced this was Scottish Mediation's banner for the year of mediation 2020. And Scottish Mediation will be coming up with ideas about how to carry that forward. One of them that they've already got in process is that there is a signatory sort of system for organizations to sign up to and commit themselves to mediation. So that is available online, and I would encourage all organizations that believe in mediation as being the first way to resolve our disputes to sign up with Scottish Mediation on that. So that will be something. The Scottish Land Commission are also going to be continuing to promote mediation in the tenant farming sector on the basis of the experience that they have felt was, and Bob McIntosh was talking about it in his piece, the experience that they have had from mediation in the tenant farming community. So they're going to carry on promoting that. And I think watch out for the announcements that are coming from them and from Bob McIntosh about it.
Thank you. I think it's Scottish Mediation's mediation charter that you were talking about. So that was perfect, and I have to say that was a genuine question that we had, and it sums up magnificently, I think, the success of the last 2 days. Thank you, Robin. So thank you all of the panel as well for that, and thank you for all of your questions. So before we continue, the results of the last poll that we had just before the Q&A session. So first of all, are you more inclined to use mediation? A huge result there. That's no one is less inclined. So I think we've done our job in this webinar. So that's a great result. And then the second part of the question, Zoom or in person. In person is still the favorite, but there's a substantial number of online preferences. And as Robin said, going forward is likely to be a combination of the two. So thank you very much. So I'm now going to hand over to Crispin Agnew QC, who will let us have a summary of the mediation outcomes and concluding remarks. Thank you.
Good day. I'm Crispin Agnew, and I've been involved in mediation for nigh on 20 years. You've just seen a model mediation to give you an idea of the process. You'll have noticed the pre-mediation meeting, the parties having an initial meeting, then breakouts from their own rooms with the mediator. You've seen the various experts meeting to discuss and see if they can agree on some of the issues. The mediator then brought the landlord and tenant together for a personal mediation, and thereafter they worked together to achieve an agreement. That's a good model and the sort of process which you can expect. But the point I want to make in particular is that the conduct of each mediation will be very different. It depends on the mediator, it depends on the issues, it depends on the parties, because you have control of the mediation. You can say to the mediator, I don't want to meet the other party. You can say, I want to meet them right at the outset, so I can set out what my position is so they know it clearly. So it's flexible and up to you, but what you've seen in this model mediation is a broad idea of how it goes. I'd like to pick up some particular points. First of all, the importance of preparation. You need to know your own case and the other party's case. You need to understand the key issues and in particular what you want to achieve out of the mediation, but not be rigid or unflexible about it. You need to have the necessary valuations, legal research, and productions that you might need, including those that haven't been shown to the other side, which you think might be necessary to refer to during the course of the mediation. And the most important point is to consider what the outcomes might be and what implications there might be there. One is, frequently that comes up, is the tax implications of any settlement if there's going to be an exchange of money. And you don't want to find yourself in the middle of the mediation saying, thank you for offering to pay me 100,000. I haven't thought about the tax implications. I need to ring around and find an accountant to advise. So that's quite important. In this mediation, you saw the suggestion of a conveyance of cottages. Had they considered that if they were going to convey cottages, what were the surrounding implications? Water rights, access rights, what impact would that have on the farmhouse, and so on. So you need to look ahead to an outcome to see if there are any issues you need to consider before that. I also want to emphasize the importance of imagination. In a mediation, you're not tied by the sort of outcomes you'd get in the court process. You can reach any conclusion you like, you can reach any settlement you like. You want to consider what the mutual benefits are, what you want, what the other party needs, and how you can meld those together to achieve it. We saw in the mediation that it wasn't really until the landlord and the tenant were got together by the mediator that they suddenly realized that the landlord ran hotels which specialized in organic food and where it came from, and whoops, the tenant farmer was organic farming. So suddenly there was a blend there which parties hadn't really thought about. So it's most important to be flexible and imaginative. Confidentiality is of course key and one of the most important factors in a mediation which you must bear in mind. I'd like to pick up on some other points from mediations which didn't really get focused in this mediation because it was really showing you the process. One thing that is frequently there is anger, mutual distrust, tensions, and so on. And that's particularly a feature of family farming partnerships and family relationships which break down from time to time. But there was a sort of hint of it here when the tenant complained about not getting the usual tenant farmers, commissioners, code advice, and so on. But it can be a real angst in a mediation, which the mediator needs to address right at the outset to get people to work through it, to lower the temperature, lower the mutual distrust, so that you can then get on with the mediation and the settlement. I've had cases where this issue has really taken up the whole morning and part of the afternoon, and we haven't really been able to get on to the mainframe until after that. So that's an important thing to remember. And the great advantage of mediation is it can resolve it or lower the temperature, which you can't do in court when you're cross-examining somebody and telling him they're a liar. It just inflames the situation. And that's a great advantage of mediation. The other thing is the mediator often challenges you. You'll come into your room and say, okay, what do you think the strengths of your case are? And you'll say, oh, well, we're undoubtedly going to win on this, that, and the other. And he'll say, why? Tell me why you're going to win. Have you thought of this? Do you think that's a weakness? And one saw that to an extent in this case. One could say the landlord was saying potatoes aren't vegetables. The tenant was saying, well, it's an arable farm which always had a root crop rotation. You can sit there and say, it's my case, but the mediator will challenge you. And that is a very, very good thing and forces you to think of your strengths and weaknesses. Another tool which is used is Whatner and Batner. Worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Now, that wasn't rarely used. We had the mediator saying to the tenant, well, what's the worst for you? To which the tenant said, well, at the end of the notice period, I'll serve my section 72(6) notice and I'll be able to stay for another 3 years. That gives me a strength because the landlord wants to have the farm as soon as possible. But it's frequent in a financial situation. You know, you're suing for 100,000. Yep, I'm going to get 100,000 when I win. Think about it. You'll spend 75,000 on expenses. And as you know, you'll only recover 50,000 of them. So actually, if you win, you'll only get 75,000. That's your best position if you're lucky. What's the worst? Well, you lose the case and you end up having spent 75,000 of your expenses and you'll have to pay the other side 50,000. So you've lost 125,000. So your best case is you get 75,000. The worst case is you own 125,000. So that's the sort of exercise which a mediator will make you do so you really understand what the best outcome is, the worst outcome is. You then have to balance your strengths and weaknesses and decide where in the medium is a good settlement. The last point I want to make is if a mediation is not successful. You were told that 4 out of 5 mediations are successful, and that's probably about right. But some don't succeed. And in my opinion, that is not necessarily a waste of time. I found on occasions that a failed mediation, in fact, lays the grounds for a settlement further down the line, because people have been through everything. They might not have settled on the day, but when you mull it over for a month or two, and the court case is tomorrow, it's the framework for a settlement. The other thing is if you actually go to court, having been forced to assess the strengths and weaknesses of your case and the strengths and weaknesses of the other party's case, it can be invaluable in deciding how to conduct your own litigation, bearing in mind that you can't use anything gained in confidentiality. So it's sometimes quite a useful exercise, and you can find that you suddenly realized you haven't presented your case in the best way possible, you need to amend, and so on before you actually end up in court. And all that was brought out by the failed mediation. So the failed mediation is not necessarily a waste of time, although I hope that any mediation will be successful. I've been a fan of mediation for many, many years, and I would rather negotiate or mediate to reach a settlement than to litigate. So I strongly commend mediation for resolving landlord and tenant and family farming disputes. Thank you.
Thank you, Crispin. That was excellent. Now, before we go, I'd like to have a word of thanks for all the participants. The mediation you have seen was, of course, edited to allow it to fit into the time available for the webinars, but the participants all spent an absolutely enormous amount of time preparing for and participating in the mock mediation. And I'm sure you all agree they have done an absolutely superb job. Thank you also to our super patient techies, to the Agricultural Law Association and the Scottish Land Commission. I'm hugely grateful to every one of them for all of their hard work in this, this mediation venture. Thank you all too for having joined us, and I hope that you all have found the webinar to have not been only extremely interesting and informative, but also an incentive to keep the possibility of mediation at the forefront of your minds as you go around your business in the future. There will be all of the videos of the entire mediation will be available on the Scottish Land Commission website from next week, and you'll be sent a link to that. Lastly, a link to a feedback form will shortly appear on your screens. Can I please ask you to complete and submit the feedback form? It'll be very useful for future planning of similar events. That brings it all to an end. Thank you very much for joining us, and good day. Thank you.